come già annunciato nei giorni scorsi, visto che ospite di PD e Social Club questa sera è un maestro del genere fantasy, l'australiano Garth Nix, di cui Fazzi propone, dopo anni che era assente dalle librerie, quello che è un testo fondativo, un titolo realmente, come dire, pietra miliare del genere, come Sabriel, primo episodio di una saga famosa come quella del Vecchio Regno. A incrociare le lame letteralmente con Garth Nix un'altra grande scrittrice, Laini Taylor, molto famosa, americana, californiana, che vive nell'Oregon, che gli lettori italiani conoscono molto bene, visto che è dal 2018 che è pubblicata sempre da Fazzi in Italia, esordì con Il Sognatore, ma ve ne ricordate bene, e pochi mesi fa Fazzi ha concluso la trilogia La Chimera di Praga pubblicando il suo Sogni di mostri e divinità. A condurre le danze, a invitare, a accompagnare Laini Taylor e Garth Nix nella loro conversazione riguardo a Sabriel, allo scrivere, al costruire storie e personaggi, ma anche a quello che è l'aspetto professionale della scrittura e del pubblicare, visti i trascorsi editoriali di Garth Nix. C'è un'altra nostra vecchia conoscenza a questo punto, che è Tiffany di Miss Fiction, una delle più amate e apprezzate book blogger italiane, con una forte vocazione esattamente nel genere fantasy. Ma a questo punto la parola la lasciamo a Tiffany, a Garth Nix e a Laini Taylor.
Ciao a tutte e tutti, benvenuti in questa live insieme a due autori speciali. Sono con me infatti Garth Nix e Laini Taylor, e oggi infatti siamo qua per una chiacchierata a tre e parleremo un po' del mondo di Sabriel e ci interfacceremo su tante questioni che hanno a che fare con questo mondo, anche delle varie ispirazioni. Intanto ciao Garth e ciao Laini. Hello, hello.
Ciao.
It's a great pleasure to have you here. And we have a few questions, so I'll begin. And whenever you want to say something, please do. Thank you. Prima di tutto, che cosa ti ha ispirato a scrivere, che cosa ti ha portato a scrivere la storia di The Old Kingdom Chronicles? Quali elementi e quali culture ti hanno ispirato?
It's a good question. I wrote Sabriel in the early 1990s, and it was first published in 1995. So I look back and I think, what was that young man thinking? What was inspiring him? It's such a long time ago. I'm not sure anymore. I do know I wanted to, as I always did from the beginning, I wanted to write the kind of book that I like to read. And I love all kinds of books, but fantasy and science fiction are the books I love the most. I guess probably just a little bit more. That depends on what's going on at the time, because I do love all kinds of fiction and non-fiction. But I think looking back, I knew I wanted to write a fantasy adventure story, and I wanted to write one about a kind of good necromancer. That was the first thing that I started with. I wanted to write about someone who could bring the dead back to life, but didn't. Instead, made them stay dead. So kind of like a reverse necromancer. So that was pretty much where I started. And then I slowly worked out that I wanted it to be about a young woman rather than a young man, because there was enough young men coming of age fantasies, so that was kind of like a happy accident for me. Because when I started it, I thought I was going to write about her father. When I wrote the prologue to the book, I thought it would be about the Abhorsen, the office of the person who keeps the dead down. And I thought it was going to be about her dad, but the prologue is about Sabriel being born. And when I wrote that, I thought, well, she is more interesting, and it would be better to have a young woman hero than another young man. And so that was a happy accident for me, really. I discovered I wanted to write about her in the process of beginning the book. I didn't know beforehand. So I guess it was in all the things that I love: fantasy, adventure, magic. And I guess I was thinking about death and what lies beyond, and whether you can come back and so on, probably because that was at that time my grandfather was dying, and it was really the first person I knew who was close to me that was going to die, and that made me think about what people have believed about what happens after you die and about various afterlives, and also the whole idea of necromancers bringing the dead back to life and so on. So those were some of the things that were at work.
Quali elementi della serie pensi che, visto che è uscito più di 20 anni fa la versione originale, pensi che parlino ancora così tanto al pubblico di oggi, e quali sono invece i tuoi elementi preferiti?
I mean, it's interesting when you write a book, you never know what things will appeal to readers and what they will love and what will keep going over the years. And I guess with the Old Kingdom books, I mean, some of the things that people particularly love are the 7 bells that the Abhorsons use that's how they use their magic to control and command the dead. The 7 name bells of the Abhorsons. Some of the characters, I think, particularly the anthropomorphic characters, Mogget and the disreputable dog, who are not in fact a cat and a dog, but they only have those shapes. I think people particularly respond to them. And I love those kinds of characters myself, which is, of course, why they're in the book. I've always loved anthropomorphic animals that are more than they seem. The actual depiction of death itself, a river that flows through 9 gates, seems to also be something that resonates with people and has stuck around. And also some things like, there's one line in the book, which I never thought about twice when I wrote it, which is, does the walker choose the path or the path the walker? That's just a rhetorical question, really. It's not a question that has an answer, but people particularly like that line. Now they get tattoos of it. They talk to me about it all the time. I never thought twice about it when I was writing it, but it's one of those happy accidents where it seemed to speak to people. So those are some of the things that I think have stood the test of time. People like the setting too, I guess, as well. So not just death, but also the sort of 1920-ish sort of pseudo-England of Ancellstiere, the wall that divides it from the Old Kingdom, and the fact that technology works in Ancellstiere, it doesn't work across the wall. Magic works in the Old Kingdom, but it doesn't work in Ancellstiere. So that sort of thing, I guess the whole setup is something that seems to have appealed to readers over the years, which is great, of course. I'm very happy that it has.
And great for happy accidents, which are the
Yes.
best. Una domanda per Laini invece è: come ha influenzato il suo lavoro, ovviamente se lo ha influenzato, il lavoro di Garth Nix nella sua scrittura, anche perché Sabriel è considerato uno dei primi young adult fantasy della nuova era.
Yes, and Garth, if you actually didn't know, I'm sure I must have said when we've spoken before that it was a total influence on me. But if I hadn't said that, it absolutely was.
It's nice to hear. I mean, there's so many things influenced me, of course, too. So
I mean, but you know, when I was a teenager, and you know, obviously, I was not a teenager when Sabriel came out. But even when I was a teenager, I wasn't reading. And there wasn't a lot of YA books then, but if there were, I wouldn't have been reading them, and I wasn't even really reading fantasy. I had loved fantasy as a young reader, as, you know, a kid and a middle grade reader. And when I became a teenager, I became extremely literary. It was very insufferable. And I, you know, only read, you know, French poetry and classics and whatnot. And I was actually laughing the other day because my 12-year-old daughter went to the bookstore with her friend, and the friend came back with Rabelais, Gargantua, and Pantagruel. And I was just cracking up because at 12, maybe that wasn't me, but later. But so then at university, as an English major, I still wasn't reading fantasy. And when I was trying to write, you know, in my early 20s, I was trying to write literature, and it was like not going anywhere. I was not having fun. I had no idea what to write about. I was like a, you know, 22, 23-year-old. You know, I had no significant life trauma to draw from or experience, and it just had nothing to write about. And around that time, you know, a big fantasy book took the world by storm for young readers, and I read it, and it was, it was fine, whatever. It was fun, but it led me to rediscover other fantasy books for young readers. And the first books that I picked up were Sabriel and The Golden Compass. And so that was just an immediate, like the world building elements in Sabriel. I always
you can say it either way. Yeah. I flip-flop myself, so you can Sabriel, potato, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, it was like a double thing. Like, I hadn't really been reading fantasy for a long time. I had been reading, 18th century, whatever. And I also hadn't been reading books for young people in a really long time. And they had happened in that time, this industry had begun. And I did work in a bookstore during college, so I was aware of things that were out there, but I wasn't like compelled to, pick them up so much. And then all of a sudden there was this huge world. And as soon as I started reading these books and discovering, and I think I was really lucky to pick those two up because they remain a couple of my favorite world building elements of all time, is your concept of death and the bells and everything that you just mentioned. I was like, I'm going to wait, but I'm going to pipe up. Like, the world building is just so wonderful and everything is so cohesive. The names of the bells, everything, like the world building was mind blowing, but also the characters and everything. It was beautiful and I loved it. And then Philip Pullman's Demons was another, I was like, wow, you can do these things. And so I started reading fantasy again, and I started reading YA books, and all of a sudden there was so much to write about. It didn't have to be about it didn't have to be about my 20-something experience, and it didn't have to be, and so I started having fun, and I started writing, and I wrote a book, and it took a while, but so yeah, you were very much a part of that journey. So.
Oh, that's good to hear. I'm glad to be part of that, and of course, in some small way, I'm glad to have spurred on your wonderful books. So
thank you.
But that's the great thing. I mean, for all of us, I think, is I am re-enthused for writing by reading all the time. Yeah. Sometimes old books, rereading them, or books I haven't known about and just hadn't discovered, even though they were around for forever. And I read something and I think, wow, that was so great. I really feel like trying to write something good myself because I've read something good.
Yeah, I absolutely feel that way. And I just want to say, I'm so glad that Sabriel is having this great continuing life over the decades now, because, so many books just don't last on the shelf like that. And as an author, it's sad to think. And, I just had read a book by, a fantasy writer who is a little bit hard to find now, and wasn't even writing that long ago. And so it's just, this awareness that things have their time and fade out. And so I love seeing reissues and new editions and new readers being found all the time.
Well, the books are similar to the dead in some ways.
They come back.
They come back. They can seem completely gone, but they can be brought back. And I love that too. I mean, particularly books that were favorites of mine as a child, which have completely disappeared, and then someone republishes them and they're rediscovered again. Yeah. And I love that. And I also like to try and help it along wherever possible too, because there are so many good books that are unfairly disappear or don't get their moment in the sun. So, well, I'm very grateful that Sabriel has just kept on being there with various sort of prominent resurgences. At the same time, there's so many more books that deserve new outings and rediscovery.
And I think you said that it wasn't an immediate success. Is that right?
No, it wasn't. No, not straight away. No. I mean, overall, it's sold far more than any of my other books, but it's never actually been technically a bestseller. Okay. So it's kind of that some of the later books were. I mean, Llewellyn and Abhorsen were both New York Times bestsellers. But in fact, Sabriel sold far more.
Actually, Daughter of Smoke and Bone was before the list was changed, and so it didn't list, but the other two did.
But it just kept on going. I mean, so there's that thing where if you have a book that just keeps on going, even modestly, ultimately over time, it will take over some books that appear to be very big, but they're not for very long. So
that's what we all want.
Slow and steady, and just persistent, always there. That's what we want. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not, in the book world, but I've just been sort of enjoying the resurgence of the Kate Bush song, Running Up That Hill.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm a big Kate Bush fan.
And I was my daughter's age when it came out, 37 years ago. I was 12. And so it's a trip, to have her listening to it now. And I just love that she's just made her first top 10 ever in the US out of this hit.
And Stranger Things has done great work for Dungeons and Dragons too.
Yeah.
Which I started playing when I was 12. And no one had ever heard of it. I mean, literally no one had ever heard of the game because it was new. And it wasn't probably for at least 6 or 7 years that my little group of friends who played ever met anyone else who knew what the hell we were talking about. So it's good when things come back. Good things.
All the good things, and we're so happy to have a new edition of Sabriel right now, because there's a new generation that is approaching to the books. So the same happened after the 10 years anniversary of Daughter of Smoke and Bone, for example. So that's great. I think I remember that I have a very similar experience to Lainey, but I was in my early adolescence, so I started with The Golden Compass and Sabriel. Because they were the only 2 editions in the library, my public library, and it's so weird to see it after so many years in the hands of new generations, but it's great. I think that means that they will survive. They are stories that keep telling something to the people, and I think it's great, right? It's one of the best things about writing books and reading books.
Absolutely. And Philip Pullman was very important in getting Sabriel known in the United Kingdom, because it wasn't published at the same time in the UK. It was published here first and then in the US, only a year apart, but it didn't actually get to the UK until about 5 or 6 years later. And Philip Pullman very kindly, gave it a brilliant quote. Blurb used on the book, which I think made a big difference. So even though The Golden Compass and Sabriel came out at the same time in America, he was incredibly helpful, and I'm very grateful to him for helping it become better known in the United Kingdom. So they're a bit slow to catch up, but they got there in the end.
Hai dei piani di espandere la serie di Sabriel e delle Old Kingdom Chronicles, visto che ci sono stati dei seguiti, ci saranno tanti libri che usciranno, e abbiamo appena finito di parlare di come sia questa nuova edizione ovviamente di Sabriel, quindi ci piacerebbe sapere se hai dei piani per espandere invece questo mondo.
Well, there are 6 books in the series now. I mean, Tersil and Eleanor, the 6th book, came out last year. So I don't have any immediate plans for more beyond those 6 books, but I have many, many notes for books and stories. And I do seem to keep coming back to it, not always very regularly. There was quite a long gap between Abhorsen and Clariel, and then a little bit more again before continuing on. But I think it's likely I will come back to it, but I have no immediate plans. My next few books that I have lined up are not Old Kingdom ones.
Okay.
So is there a new Italian edition? Is that
of Sabriel?
Yes.
Sabriel?
Yes.
Which covers did they go with, or did they do new ones?
Let me it,
I was just looking for one before, but I haven't got one in my office. Which
oh my gosh, I don't know about you, but the foreign edition mailings just really dried up over, and I just missed them. I miss getting them. Okay, no, so it's just an iconic cover.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
That's
looks
beautiful,
great.
Yeah.
So beautiful.
It's very shiny. It's very shiny, but it has the charter mark, and it looks great. Yeah.
Awesome.
But yeah, that's all the translated editions. The copies are, yes, I don't know if it's international mail and other things going on, but
it was always, when I started getting foreign editions, it was just such the dream to start, have that shelf, and it's always been one of my favorite things is getting those in the mail, and it's been a really long time. And so I see them online and try to keep track so I can maybe hopefully one day track them down, but I think some of them are just lost to me.
Well, if you don't get them at the time, it's often quite hard later. But yeah, it is. It's very exciting. I mean, getting a new book of any I still get very excited when any new book arrives. I mean, I've been doing this for so long and I've written lots and lots of books. I guess it's good that I still get very excited when a box arrives and wow, it's my new book.
And since you're, more of my generation, you might remember this in the movie Back to the Future. There's a scene that only writers usually remember, and it's a scene where the author's father at the end gets a box of his first published book, like from his publisher in the mail. And so I've always called it the Back to the Future box.
Yes.
But young people don't, or non-writers, like that doesn't register in their mind. But that was like the first time I think I formed that dream. Oh my gosh, getting a box of books from your publisher
of your own book. Yeah. I know it's interesting what gets normalized though. I mean, I get boxes of books all the time. There's different editions and things. And for my kids, their whole life, there's just been boxes of books arriving at the house of my books. So they're completely blasé about it. It's just like, oh yeah, a box came for your dad. And it's like, I'm like, wow, it's my new book. It's the new.
No, actually, it was funny.
And they're like, whatever.
And we were in Paris a couple of months ago. We went into my French publisher, and Clementine, she's the same, jaded. I mean, she thinks it's cool, whatever. But my French publisher is the third biggest manga translator in France, and they do My Hero Academia, which is her favorite. And so it was like the most I've seen her like actually excited to be in a publishing office ever because they had all this manga everywhere. So that was cool.
My boys expect me, and my wife's a publisher, so they expect between both of us that we know every single famous author in the world and can just connect them if necessary. But they're very rarely impressed by them. But every now and again they are impressed by someone that we know, and it's someone that they read. And it's interesting that those favourites are like a different order above all the others, including their own father. It's like you're not special, but the person that you vaguely know is very special. That's good. I guess.
I did get a little thrill the other day though, because my daughter was group texting with her friends, and she actually recommended one of my books. And another friend on the group text said, Laini Taylor's your mom? And she's my second favorite author, which was awesome. But of course, I'm like, well, who's his favorite author?
Who's first?
But
who was it?
I didn't find out, but I'm going to find out. No. But that was amazing. That was really cool.
I would take second favorite. Even third, fourth, fifth favorite would do. It's amongst my son's friends, but
I was completely thrilled. It's great.
It's a great badge of honor, like second favorite author is great, I think.
Oh yeah, it's huge.
Ci sono mai stati progetti per lo sviluppo di un film o una serie TV ispirati all'universo di Sabriel? Ti piacerebbe che un progetto di questo genere si sviluppasse?
There's been a lot over the years which have just not eventuated. It was set up to be a film in 2009, 2010, which I was co-writing with an Oscar-nominated screenwriter who was a great writer, and I enjoyed wandering around Hollywood with him, and it was actually with Plan B, Brad Pitt's company, so that was kind of exciting and interesting. But we couldn't get it set up ultimately. Curiously, back then, one of the issues that kept coming up, and I'm glad it's not the case now, is that all the studios were worried that it was a female-led story. So there's this question kept being asked: when does the guy come in? The guy being Touchstone, because we'd do our pitch, and then they'd listen to it and they'd go, "When does the guy come in again?" And we're like, "Well, that's kind of like not the most important thing." But for whatever reason, that time it didn't happen. And there's been a couple other times it was set up for a film, which didn't work out. Then about 4 years ago, we had it set up at Amazon as a series, and I co-wrote a pilot with a friend of mine who's a very accomplished screenwriter, also one of my oldest friends I've known since I was 4 years old. She's a wonderful Australian screenwriter. But Amazon chose not to pick that up after we wrote the pilot, possibly because they just bought The Lord of the Rings, and they didn't need another big. It's like, we got the big fantasy, we don't need the little ones. We've got Lord of the Rings. Or who knows? That's a very strange world. And then about 2 years ago, it was very briefly set up at big studio. But then they found out they actually already owned a much older sort of YA fantasy. And they decided it was too similar, even though there's actually no similarities really, apart from the fact that it's fantasy, fantasy adventure. But they already had one, I guess, which I notice has not been made. So, you know, who knows? So
well, what we really need are apparently 6 more Game of Thrones spinoffs instead of
yeah.
And another Lord of the Rings, like.
I mean, at least it's not just a remake of
it's
Lord
not
of the
just a remix.
But yeah, I would rather have some original material out there, and I would love to see a Sabriel movie or something animated would be awesome.
Yeah, I'd love to see a good one. And you know, I probably have made it more difficult by wanting a high degree of involvement, which it raises the bar, because you know, typically studios and production companies don't want the original author involved for all kinds of reasons. Some of them actually very sensible. But yeah, I've tried to be, for this, I've tried to be involved. I don't do that with all of my various books, and some of my books, you know, I've just let them be, and they've been optioned, and I've not been heavily involved. Because you just got to choose how much you can do. Frogkisser, for example, is in development with Disney as an animated musical.
What is?
Frogkisser.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That was exciting.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, and that's been ongoing. I think they're up to their 3rd script now. So we will see. But so things like that, and then there's some other things going on.
Yeah, it's amazing how many things have to come together just right for to get those green lights. What's
happening with Daughter of Smoke and Bone? Because that was going ahead at one stage, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it's been a while now, but it got, you know, up to the sort of the place at the table with the head of, you know, the studio, where you know, and it had the director and the script and everything in it. At that point, didn't go any further, and that's been like 8 years or something. So, and there's you know, new efforts, but again, it's just one of those, you know, you've got to, it's just, everything has to come together just right, and you really need somebody passionate fighting for it. But also, I don't know, it's just tricky. I mean, I have hopes, and we'll see. Fingers crossed.
It's the conjunction of the planets. It's just something that will either happen or it won't.
Yeah. I try not to invest like any energy in, like, you know, any actual hope in it. Like, it would be cool, but it's just so beyond my sphere that I can't think about it too much.
And it takes an enormous amount of energy and time if you do want to get heavily invested in it. You know, that time I spent in Hollywood back in 2009, I think I probably ultimately ended up being probably sort of 9 months out of the year, going backwards and forwards and having meetings, and I actually enjoyed it, but I also had to make a decision not to continue doing that, because my business is writing books. It's not trying to get films made.
I wasn't that heavily involved, but there was a year or so where I did, you know, get to go down to meetings and stuff, and it was very exciting. And I did write a draft of a screenplay and got to be in the Writers Guild for a little while, and that was all very cool. But it really is a big distraction from writing your books.
Yeah, I mean, I've now written a film screenplay of Sabriel. I've written a pilot and a Bible for a television series of Sabriel, and some other odds and ends along the way, which is, you know, is interesting. And in fact, I trained as a screenwriter. That was my university degree. I just didn't pursue it after I left university. I wrote stories and books instead. So I still have a sort of, I do like screenwriting, and it's a different kind of writing that I enjoy, but you just got to, again, it's about choosing what you do, isn't it?
Well, it's so different. And I have a friend who's a screenwriter as well, and just the way that they have to contort themselves to anticipate what other people they're going to want at every level. And it's just, I mean, it's so different than writing a book. And I don't think everyone can do it. I mean, being able to let go of your ego to that degree.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's times I've worked on things where because you have really total control writing a book, and then screenwriting you do not, and things will change, and also the input you have where you'll be asked to change something completely and utterly, and it's just part of the deal. It makes it a whole different world. So it's kind of interesting I enjoyed sort of dipping my toe in from time to time, but yeah. I'm also quite glad to just come back to writing books often. Yeah.
Also, from a viewer point of view, we've watched so many horrible adaptations. Oh, yeah. So I guess that it has to be the perfect project. Well, not perfect, but the most the closest to the idea of the book, or the idea of what's in the author's mind.
Yeah.
So at the same time, though, I think about this experience that I had that was like crystallized in my mind, because I was in an airport bookstore in Texas, and like I just overheard a mother and a teenage daughter shopping for books, and literally the only things that even registered, that their eyes even saw, were things that had been adapted. Like every other book was invisible to them. If they didn't already know the title from a TV show or a movie, they didn't even see it. And so I think of even a mediocre show as a really great ad campaign for the book. Yes. So I suppose if it's bad enough, it can actually harm the book, but I don't know how bad it has to be.
Well, I think the common wisdom is that even absolutely terrible adaptations can't hurt the book, because the book exists. It doesn't alter the book.
But I mean, like how off-putting could it be? I
think it does hurt an author's spirit. I think to see a really, really terrible adaptation of your work, and I have some friends who unfortunately had really, really terrible movies made of their books, and I think it is painful, and it's painful on several different levels. You can intellectually know the book is not altered. The book exists and people can read it and forget about the terrible film. But that's hard to do. And I think if you wrote it, it would be tricky. But then, of course, you can't control it. All you can do is try and choose the good people to work with and hope that they will stay with the project, and other terrible people won't interfere with it and turn it into something awful.
Just hope that you get that, marketing boost out of it.
Yeah.
Siete stati entrambi nell'editoria, nel mondo dell'editoria per diversi anni ad ora. E quali sono i principali cambiamenti a cui avete assistito, e che cosa vi manca del passato e che cosa invece pensate sia positivo di questo momento nel mondo dell'editoria?
That's an interesting question, because sometimes the sort of good changes are mixed up with the bad changes, so it's hard to separate them. One of the things that I do miss are bookshops, as in a very broad range, particularly of independent bookshops. Australia, it's not so bad. We still have quite a number, but not as many as we once did. I think it's a much harder business to be in. But on the sort of flip side of that is that there were also lots of weird problems with old bookshops as well, in terms of how publishing worked, the sort of slowness of publishing and some of the sort of ingrained practices that went back centuries, which meant it was really hard to get books and it took too long to get them and so on. So, it's all a bit mixed up in the sense that I welcome some of the changes, but some of those changes have made problems for some of the things I liked as well. So, I read ebooks a lot, and I love the immediacy and availability of ebooks. I wish they'd not given rise to a monopoly behemoth at the same time. So it's kind of mixed feelings. A lot of the sort of more leisurely aspects of publishing and book selling, I think it's good that they've gone for the most part, except that I'd still like some of them, if that makes sense. But of course you can't have that.
On the positive side, definitely is the increased diversity in voices and characters, portrayals. The kind of characters my daughter is reading about were just not, common at all when I was a young reader. It was really hard to find different cultures represented, let alone sexualities and different lifestyles. And it's just now, a lot easier for kids to find themselves reflected in books. And though, of course, in the U.S., they're really fighting hard to take that away and make
there's forces here too, but less so, I think, than the US. But yeah, that's a very welcome change and massively overdue one as well.
Yeah, I think right now for writers trying to break in, it's gotten really, really crappy, I think, during the pandemic, but also just over time. I think the publishing industry in the US, at least, has been really overtaxed. Like the people who work in publishing are so overworked and overburdened and underpaid that it's stacked up to the point that people who are trying to break in and get their submissions read and whatnot are just not hearing back. And it's so painful. It's such a painful time for an author to be in that early stage where they're submitting their book and, they know they're ready. They know their manuscripts are good and they just can't get to that next place. It's so rough. And I think, that the last couple of years have been particularly hard. I, know a lot of writers trying to break in, and it's not fun.
Yeah, and I guess the other side of that too is for established writers, the sort of the old mid list has gone too. So where you could basically earn a living with your books doing sort of okay, but not amazingly, that's so much harder now. It's like as well.
All movies have to be blockbusters now. Like there's no, mid-budget adult dramas are like rare these days. Yeah, it's like that with books too.
And the very big successes sort of soak up all the attention and the marketing money and so on. That seems to be a trend that's continuing. I mean, again, offsetting that, there is the rise of self-publishing, which is another avenue which really wasn't plausible even 10, 15 years ago, but that's also complicated.
I think that had a heyday and then it got a lot more challenging too. I feel like, I don't know the details, but that Amazon made it really great and then, kind of took it away and made it less profitable and less lucrative for people.
Yeah, and that's part of the basic problem is that the self-publishing avenue was controlled by one entity, basically. So it's not really independent, totally. It's not really independent. I mean, you don't have a contract, you just have whatever they tell you it's going to be. But at least it was another avenue which didn't exist, and it is still another avenue.
Yeah.
So it's all mixed up. I do think probably the last 3 or 4 years have made things a lot harder across all the avenues, and for people working in publishing as well, and that probably is a reflection that times are more difficult for everybody in every industry, perhaps. I'm not
but
sure.
I feel like at the beginning of the pandemic, the publishers anticipated a drop in profits. And in fact, so they tightened their belts and they consolidated. People got more work on their, positions combined. And then in fact, the opposite happened and profits went up. But do you think that they passed that on to the employees who were, doing their best to, no, like they didn't. And so it's just not gone. I don't know. I get the sense that there's a lot of people quitting, a lot of the younger employees, like people can't afford to break in to publishing anymore. They can't, it's just not feasible. I don't know.
Yeah, it's always been very hard. And I think particularly in the US, when it was so New York focused, just living, and in the UK and London, just being able to afford to live in those cities.
Yeah, here's your entry level. Yeah, so it bred a class of people who were, who could be supported by their families while they were breaking into this industry, and it completely excluded people who couldn't do that. Yeah. Where's the head of the Australian publishing industry? Is that?
It's sort of evenly split between Sydney and Melbourne, which are both very expensive cities to be in. I mean, I think sort of one of the pandemic things is that it is so much more possible to work not in the big cities, and that certainly has applied to publishing as well. So maybe that's another change that we'll see where working in publishing may not be so difficult, except that I think probably breaking in, you still need to be. It's probably still easier if you're able to be in the big cities.
Right.
So I don't know, is Italy the same? Do you need to be in Rome?
It's the same. Most of the publishers are in Milan. some are in Turin, and some are in Rome, but the smaller one, like Fazzi.
I didn't realize that Milan was
Milan is the center of everything in Italy, basically.
It's the industrial center, isn't it?
From an industrial point of view, it's like the city, more than Rome, which is our capital, but it's different. There are different kind of working habits, let's say, and the industries are quite different. But still, it's a lot has changed even in Italian publishing industry, and even the more people reading, which is the biggest problem in the Italian market, because we don't have many readers in numbers, I mean. But it's quite expanding. It's an expanding market, so I just hope it will turn out into workers' rights and all the things that should come with an expanding market. Per concludere questa chiacchierata, l'ultimissima domanda è: cosa state leggendo in questo momento?
What's that word? Chiacchierata? Chiacchierata?
Chiacchierata, it's a chat.
That's great. What a great word.
It's also very difficult to pronounce for foreigners. Chiacchierata, yes.
Okay. Garth?
Go. I'm always reading lots of things at the same time, so I have to sort of carefully think about this. So the last novel I read was Master of Jinn by P. Djeli Clark, which I liked a lot. Have you read it?
I read one of the novellas is all, and I loved it. And I keep meaning to get, it was like an Audible, one of the Audible novellas.
I read them.
So I really want to get the novels.
Yeah, no, it's really good. I really enjoyed that. So Master of Jinn was great. And then before that I read A Marvelous Light by Freya Marske, because I was on a panel with her recently, which is always a good prompt to read new things that I wouldn't otherwise read. And I'm always rereading as well. And I've just been often sort of comfort reading, I think, things that I love and return to. And I've just reread some of Georgette Heyer's Regency romances for like the 11th billionth time. Though my favourites have changed over the years as I've got older, which is kind of interesting. Some of the ones I didn't like so much when I first read her as a teenager, I like far more now. So that's kind of interesting. And I just reread some of Elizabeth Moon's science fiction space operas, the Cyrano books, which I really like. So I've been reading those. And I'm also reading some non-fiction as well, which I always do. So I'm reading a history of the Anglo-Saxons by Mark Morris, who's a great historian. And that's very good. And I've got a couple other things as well.
Is that covering the formation of England, or is that
it's a history of early
Kingdom era, or
early England. So it's basically from the Romans to the Normans, that period. So but he's a very readable historian. He wrote an excellent biography of King John as well, who's kind of always been an interesting character, I think. So that's just some of the things that I've been reading, and the letters of Graham Greene. I love authors' letters, collections of authors' letters. I was at my local bookshop and it was on specials, like a third of its normal price, so I couldn't resist it. And of course they're so often they're all about money. Authors' letters, they're always about, I managed to get this from my publisher and so on. I'm hoping to get £10 for this story and that sort of thing, which I always find. It's the old joke is that beginning authors talk about the art and the craft, and established authors always just talk about the money.
Yeah, there was definitely this period where, when you have local writers groups that get together, and there's the published and the not yet published, and you bitch about completely different things. And once you're published, you can't really bitch in front of the unpublished authors because they won't have any sympathy for the things you're now.
No, of course not. Yeah. Yeah, it's what a friend of mine and I just speaking of ourselves, we call it rich fat author syndrome, where you're sitting around complaining about something which is actually only a problem if you're very well established, and if you're beginning would be, I would love to have that problem.
Yes, give me that problem.
Could I have that problem?
Yeah.
So yes, so authors' letters are always interesting for that, and also because the art and the craft is also very interesting to me as well. Not just the business.
I mean, I do marvel at the letter writing of the past, and just how everybody, I read a book of letters that was, it was actually one family, I think it was their letters from India home to England during the Raj era. And these were just, ordinary upper class, educated people, but they weren't writers, they weren't artists, but they're just their way with words, and not to mention their penmanship. It was just glorious, to think that everybody could write that kind of sentence and convey their experience in that way, And now we have texts, It's very sad. But I am reading this, and I am doing an event with this author, Shweta Thakrar, next week. This is her second book, and it's based on, it's, a high fantasy, but the setting is inspired by India and Hindu mythology, or Hindu lore, and it's very, very cool and beautiful. And I used her name as one of I asked her if she minded, years ago, 5, 6, I don't know how many years ago, when I wrote Strange the Dreamer, each section starts with a invented word with a meaning, and the word Thakrar in Strange the Dreamer means the point at which awe becomes terror and terror becomes awe. And she did not mind me using her name for that. She gave me her blessing. But so this is really lovely. I've just read a book by Patricia McKillop, who I have never read because my big hole in my fantasy reading, during those years when I wasn't reading fantasy. And she just sadly passed away, and has a lot of beautiful books out. And because she was being talked about when she sadly died recently, I thought now is the time. And it was gorgeous.
She's a wonderful writer. I mean, I love The Riddle Master of Head, which I
have only read The Song of the Basilisk now, and I have a couple more stacked up. But so The Riddle Master, that's the one you would recommend?
Yeah, it's the first one I read of hers. I read it when I was 14 or whatever. Yeah. So of course you have a particular fondness, but I have reread it several times over the years, and I like the whole trilogy, but I like The Riddle Master the best of them. But they're all great, so you should definitely read that. I would recommend that trilogy. Yeah.
Okay. I also love Signet. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's like Signet.
Like a baby swan signet?
Signet.
Yeah.
Signet.
Yeah, exactly. That's great. It's inspired by Slavic mythology, and I love it.
And the Book of Atrix Wolf is also another one of hers. That, in fact, I love all of hers. They're great. They're all fantastic.
I've also just been rereading Lois McMaster Bujold.
Oh, I'm a huge fan. Yeah,
I have only read the Chalion books.
I love them all. Yeah,
but I love these. They're wonderful, and so I do want to get more of her.
Have you been reading the Penric and Desdemona novellas?
Yes. Oh my God,
which are also fantastic. But The Curse of Chalion is probably, she's one of my favorite authors, but The Curse of Chalion is probably my absolute favorite of them all, which is it's always hard to pick out something that.
Yeah, I think
when you have an author whose all their books are good. But that one is just a little bit above.
And it's so good. And then I read Paladin of Souls right after. And I think I liked that a little bit more just because you so seldom have a fantasy main character who's a woman whose children have grown up and who's, sort of at the end of her usefulness. And, in a fantasy setting, you don't have a 45-year-old woman having adventures and falling in love. It's
and she does it so well. She does it so well. Yeah, no, I'm a big fan.
Yeah, so I'm excited to read more of her books. But that was my second read of the Chalion books. So now I'm ready to check out some more. Yeah.
That's great. So thank you so much for chatting with me. It's been a great pleasure, and I'm very happy. I'm still quite shocked that Lainey hasn't had pink hair for the first time.
Pandemic did me in.
Still, thank you very much. It's been great, and I'm so glad that finally Sabriel is back in Italy, and I hope to see you both here again. And
I hope so. Yeah,
I really hope so. Maybe there will be chances in the near future.
Well, you never know. I mean, my wife normally goes to Bologna every year, and the last time I was in Italy was Bologna, for the book fair.
I've never been to the
children's book fair. Yeah,
Tiffany, do you go to it? Do you go to it, Tiffany?
Yes, I usually attend because it's here basically. So that's great. I know it's very famous outside of Italy, the Bologna Children Book Fair. It's one of the.
Was it back this year in full force?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A bit contracted than usually, but still, it was the usual form or the usual shape of the fair. So I hope to see you here both.
Let's hope so.
And thank you again for spending some time with me this morning. Let's say hi to the Italian viewers of this interview. Io ringrazio ovviamente Laini Taylor e Garth Nix per aver chiacchierato con me per questa discussione, e insomma siamo molto contenti che Sabriel sia tornato finalmente in Italia e speriamo di vederli anche dal vivo. So you are invited whenever you want to come, and we will.
E grazie ai lettori italiani, grazie per leggere.
Thank you very much. If you
grazie,
want to,
Tiffany.
Oh, thanks to you.
Yes, thank you.
That was great, and thank you again for.
Thank you. Nice to see you too, Laini.
Nice to see you, Garth. Yeah, and hope you get some rain, Tiffany, and some break in the heat.
Yeah, I hope so.
Absolutely. Yeah. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bene, come dicevamo, una conversazione ricchissima, si è parlato veramente di tutto ed è stato molto bello sentire come due colleghi si confrontano sui temi a loro cari della scrittura e della costruzione dei libri. Con questo chiudiamo questa serie di PDA Social Club che va in vacanza per un paio di mesi e ci ritroveremo a settembre con nuovi appuntamenti, con nuovi libri, con nuovi autori. Intanto grazie a tutti, grazie agli autori, grazie agli editori che ci hanno messo in contatto con gli autori, grazie ovviamente alle tantissime librerie che in questi mesi hanno condiviso sulle proprie pagine Facebook le nostre conversazioni e grazie soprattutto all'Inclito Pubblico. Buona estate a tutti, ci rivediamo a settembre.